They said the Red Mesa Plains hadn't seen rain or mercy in months. But one evening, when a lone cowboy found a dying foal beneath its fallen mother, something ancient stirred beneath the storm clouds. He thought he was saving a life. He didn't know he was awakening a legend. Because when the thunder rolled and the lightning split the sky, a colossal horse silver, as the storm itself emerged from the darkness. And what it did next would defy everything a man believed about the wild. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The first light of dawn spilled across the high desert like a slow-burning flame. Over the mesas of northern Arizona, the world woke not with sound, but with color, deep reds, muted golds, and the pale shimmer of dust hanging in the dry air. The cracked earth glowed as if lit from within, and every ridge and cactus cast long, solemn shadows that stretched toward the horizon. A wind drifted in from the Mojave, carrying the scorched scent of iron-rich stone and brittle sagebrush, ready to crumble at a touch. The giant saguaro cacti stood like watchtowers, their arms frozen in quiet salute to a sun that hadn't yet cleared the horizon. The air trembled faintly dry, sharp electric. It was the kind of morning that made a man feel both infinite and small part of something old and watching. At the base of a low hill, the outline of Callahan Ranch lay still a single barn, a corral, a modest cabin leaning slightly under its own years. Its tin roof glowed a dull copper under the first light. Smoke from last night's fire had long faded, leaving only the faint smell of ash and pine. And somewhere inside, Ethan Callahan stirred awake. He was 36, too young to be called an old-timer, too weathered to pass for anything else. He moved slow, careful the way men do when they've learned how quickly the world can take what it gives. In the half-light, he pulled on his boots, shrugged into a worn denim shirt, and paused a moment by the window. Beyond the glass, the plains spread endless and empty. He'd been looking at that same horizon for 10 years now, every morning at dawn. And somehow, it still managed to surprise him. Outside, the desert was already breathing heat. The red dust shimmered where the sunlight struck it, and the mesas stood tall and silent, their edges bright as molten copper. Ethan sipped coffee that tasted like rust and smoke, watching a hawk trace slow circles above the canyon rim. That hawk had been nesting in the same crag for 3 seasons now, maybe more. It was one of the few living things he saw regularly out here. Whisper, his gray gelding, snorted in the corral, an old soul of a horse with a mind of his own, and a patience that matched his master's. Ethan smiled faintly and set the mug down. "Morning, old boy," he muttered, voice low and gravelly from disuse. Whisper flicked an ear toward the cabin as if answering. He walked out to the yard, the boards creaking beneath his boots. The world felt brittle. The dry grass was pale as bone, and even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Somewhere down in Broken Arrow Canyon, a stream still trickled but weakly, like the last breath of something dying slow. It was always this way near the end of summer. But that morning, something felt off. He couldn't put a name to it at first. It wasn't just the silence. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. No birds, no insects. Even the air felt like it was waiting for permission to move. Ethan leaned on the corral post, scanning the horizon. Nothing stirred. Normally, he'd have seen the wild herd by now, or the Red Mesa Mustangs that came down at sunrise to drink from the shallow creek north of the canyon. But the plains were empty, the waterholes still and untouched. He frowned, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "That's strange," he murmured. Whisper shifted uneasily, ears twitching, nostrils flaring toward the west. A prickle ran down Ethan's spine. He'd been on the land long enough to trust a horse's instincts over his own. The wind changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, and carried with it a smell that didn't belong, a metallic tang, faint but sharp like the air right before a lightning strike. He turned his eyes toward the horizon. To the far west, the sky had thickened into a dull gray bruise. Electric threads flashed deep within it, silent for now but growing. Not another storm, he muttered. Not this early in the season. He finished the coffee, poured the last drop into the dust, and stood still for a long while. The mesa ridges flickered with heat haze. Everything shimmered like a mirage. Even the light felt heavier than it should. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and leather wrapped around him like memory. Tools hung in careful order. He'd built the racks himself years ago when there'd been no one else to rely on. The quiet pressed closer, a weight that made his chest tighten. He checked the latch on the feed room, the water trough, the saddle straps, habits, older than reason, born of solitude and repetition. Whisper followed him with slow steps, as if unwilling to break the stillness. When Ethan reached for the saddle, the horse sidestepped, once restless. "Easy," he said softly, voice almost a whisper of its own. "Come on, old boy. Let's see what's got the wind so nervous." The saddle leather creaked as he swung up. He tugged the brim of his hat lower, squinting into the light. Then with a squeeze of his knees, he and Whisper started down the dirt track that curved along the edge of the canyon. The morning stretched wide and bright, but the light had a strange hue, too red, too dense. In the distance, dust rose in faint spirals, dancing under the heat like spirits. The mesas caught the sun in jagged flashes, as though the land itself were alive, shifting beneath its own skin. Ethan's shadow rode long beside him, twin to the horses. Each step stirred up powdery dirt that clung to their boots and hooves. He rode without hurry, but his mind kept circling back to the silence, to the absent birds, to the smell of iron in the wind. It felt like the desert was holding its breath. At the ridge, he reined in and looked west. Far off, a storm was forming, not one of those brief desert tempests that came and went with a few drops of rain, but a wall of darkness pulsing with inner light. He could almost taste the electricity from where he sat. Thunder grumbled faintly across the basin. "Hell," he whispered under his breath. "If this keeps up, we're in for trouble." Whisper's ears flicked back uneasy. The horse tossed its head, once nostrils flaring. Ethan reached forward, patting its neck. "Easy there. We'll ride high ground, keep an eye on it." They moved on the sound of hooves, muffled by sand. The only other noise was the whisper of wind pushing through brittle weeds. A hawk cried once from somewhere far above, a lonely, ragged sound that vanished almost as soon as it began. By noon, the color had drained from the sky. The clouds rolled in low and black, dragging long curtains of dust across the mesa. Wind screamed out of Broken Arrow Canyon, lifting red earth into the air until it blurred the horizon. The desert moments ago, still as stone, had turned into a furnace of motion, sand smoke, and wind twisting together in violent dance. Ethan pulled his hat tight and urged Whisper into a gallop, leaning low against the saddle as the first drops of rain spattered his coat. He'd seen storms like this before, ones that came without warning, born of heat and static and rage. But this one felt different. The wind had a weight to it, a sound like something alive. "Come on, old boy, move," he shouted over the rising howl. They reached the ranch, just as the first lightning forked across the sky, lighting the plains in a flash of silver fire. The air split open with a roar, and the world turned white. Whisper reared and kicked at the air, his eyes wide with panic. Ethan slid off the saddle and grabbed his halter, steadying him, then ran for the corral gates. The younger horses were already bolting and circling in terror, snorting clouds of steam into the air. He flung the gate wide, herding them into the main barn with practiced motions. Another crack of lightning tore through the clouds, closer this time, of the sound chasing itself down the canyon walls like rolling drums. The sky burned white again, and for a moment, he saw his own shadow thrown huge against the barn's interior wall. Easy, easy, damn it. He slammed the gate shut just as the wind hit full force, shoving against the boards like an invisible hand. Then came the thunderclap that split the world. It hit so close that the ground itself seemed to buckle. Ethan staggered against the wall, his ears ringing. Whisper screamed and kicked nostrils, flaring eyes rolling white. The air filled with a metallic tang of ozone and smoke. Somewhere nearby, maybe down by the canyon, something had taken a direct strike. Rain came next. Not drops, but a sheet. It fell hard and fast, turning dust to mud, hissing on hot stone. Ethan crouched by the open doorway, watching as the sky dumped its fury on the land. In minutes, everything was swallowed in a gray blur. All he could see were the lightning flashes, white veins, and a black body. For nearly an hour, he waited until the thunder softened to a distant murmur, and the rain slowed to a steady whisper. When the storm finally began to move east, the world it left behind felt scraped clean and raw. The air smelled of wet ash and burned metal. Every breath carried the ghost of fire. He saddled Whisper again and rode out, careful scanning the soaked earth for damage. The corral had held, though 2 fence posts were blackened. Patches of grass still smoked faint tendrils of steam, curling upward from the heat that lingered underground. He dismounted to feel the soil. It was warm, almost alive beneath his palm. But it was what lay farther out that caught his attention. Down near the slope toward the creek, the ground was churned up a mess of prints and dragged marks. He knelt to study them, hoof prints dozens overlapping, deep sharp, pressed into wet earth. Beside them, smaller shapes. Paws, wolves, a pack from the size of the impressions. Ethan ran a calloused hand across the mud. It was still damp with more than rain, a thin, dark stain that glistened red when the light hit it. Blood, fresh. He rose slowly, glancing toward the ravine. The wind carried a faint smell beneath the rain. Something burned, something wrong. Whisper pawed at the ground, tossing his head. The horse wanted to turn back. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured. "Just tracks, that's all." But the words rang hollow, even to his own ears. He could feel it, the pull in his gut that every cowboy learns to trust. Something had happened out here. Something alive had not made it through the storm. He followed the trail down the slope, weaving through tufts of wet yucca and blackened sagebrush. Lightning had scorched a wide patch of earth, fusing sand into dark glass. The smell grew stronger, burnt hair, scorched flesh. And then he saw it. In a shallow dip of the land lay a mare, her body twisted on one side, the hide blackened where the bolt had struck. Steam rose faintly from her flank, and the air shimmered above her like heat off iron. The sight stopped Ethan cold. "God almighty," he breathed. He dropped to one knee beside her. The strike had burned straight through from shoulder to hip, leaving a charred line of destruction. There was no brand, no halter, no rope. A wild one. He touched the mare's neck. It was still warm. The smell of rain and smoke made his stomach twist. He sat back on his heels, hat dripping, ready to turn away, and then he heard it. A sound faint as a breath. He froze. At first he thought it was the wind, but then it came again, a soft, trembling exhale. He leaned forward, pressing an ear closer to the ground. Where? He shifted the mare's body, slightly pulling at a collapsed rib, and there beneath her, half buried in mud, a small shape moved weakly. A foal. Its body was covered in red dust and ash legs, tangled beneath the mare's ribcage. One hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The tiny chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Its fur, a pale gold mixed with the color of wet clay, clung flat against its skin. Its eyes were open, but clouded, unfocused, blinking slow. Ethan's throat tightened. He reached out, brushing mud from its muzzle. The foal's breath came out in shuddering gasps, each one smaller than the last. He could feel the heat of life slipping. "Lord Almighty," he whispered again, but this time it wasn't surprise. It was prayer. He shrugged out of his oilskin coat, spreading it over the foal. Gently, he ran his hands down its side, feeling for breaks or deeper wounds. The back leg was swollen, blood seeping from a gash near the shoulder. Dehydration had already set in lips, cracked tongue dry. "You poor little thing," he muttered. Whisper stood a few yards away, shifting nervously, ears pinned flat. Ethan glanced around. The open plain stretched silent in every direction. No sign of the herd. No movement at all, except far up the ridge the faint silhouettes of circling crows. Predators would come soon. Wolves, maybe coyotes. The scent of blood carried fast in this land. He ran a hand down his face, thinking. He knew what the code said: nature takes care of its own. The strong live, the weak die. But standing there in the gray light after the storm, those words felt hollow. He looked down at the foal again. It blinked once, slow, as if pleading. "Hang on, little one," he said softly. "I got you." He slipped his arms beneath its body, lifting carefully. It was lighter than he expected, fragile bones, loose skin, barely 5 pounds of life. The foal's head lolled against his shoulder. Its breath fluttered warm against his neck, faint but there. Rain began again, softer now, more like a benediction than a threat. Ethan wrapped the coat tighter, pressing the foal against his chest to shield it. Then he turned and whistled for Whisper. The gray horse hesitated, blowing hard through its nostrils. But when Ethan spoke, "Come here, boy. We're taking him home." Whisper obeyed. Ethan slung one arm over the saddle horn, used the other to balance the tiny body across the horse's withers. He tied the coat corners tight around it, making a cradle. The clouds were breaking open again, light returning in fractured pieces. But the storm wasn't done. Thunder still muttered low across the plains. Ethan climbed into the saddle, holding the foal steady with one arm gripping the reins with the other. "Let's get him home," he said quietly. Whisper started forward at a careful trot, hooves splashing through shallow puddles that mirrored the gray sky. The wind stung Ethan's face, the rain turning to fine mist that clung to his lashes. Behind them, the burned mare lay silent, her dark shape slowly fading into the landscape. For a moment, lightning flashed again, and the dead horse glowed white against the red earth, a brief, terrible monument. Ahead through the sheet of rain, the faint glow of Callahan Ranch flickered, a single lantern left, burning through the storm. It was the only light for miles, trembling in the darkness, like hope itself. By the time Ethan reached the barn, the rain was a living thing, roaring, pounding, drowning out in every other sound. The lamp hanging by the cabin door burned faintly through the downpour, a single trembling glow swallowed by curtains of water. Whisper's hooves slipped in the mud, but the old gelding dug in, fighting for balance, refusing to let the fragile body draped across his back fall. Lightning ripped the horizon open again, bright as day for a heartbeat, showing the ranch blurred behind a wall of rain. Ethan jumped down one arm, still holding the foal against him. The mud sucked at his boots as he half ran toward the barn. Each breath came out as a cloud, hot and ragged in the cold air. The foal didn't move. It was too light, too limp, like holding smoke. He slammed open the barn door. Warmth met him at once, the soft, heavy air of hay-horse sweat and smoke from the small stove in the corner. He ducked inside, kicked the door shut behind him, and dropped the iron latch. The wind howled once more, then was gone, muffled by the thick wooden walls. For a moment, he just stood there, drenched water dripping from his hat brim. His heart hammered against the weight in his arms. Then instinct took over. He crossed to the far corner where an old wool blanket lay spread beside the stove, the same place he'd nursed sick horses before. He lowered the foal gently onto it, his knees creaking as he crouched down beside the tiny body. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant but restless. Inside, only the fire spoke a low hiss and crackle that filled the quiet with life. He worked quickly. First, he stripped the saddle from Whisper and hung the dripping tack on its peg. Then he dragged out an old metal first aid box, dented and streaked with rust. It had traveled with him through 10 different ranches 1,000 miles, and one war of his own making. "Hold on, kid," he muttered, snapping the box open. "We're not done yet." The supplies were meager but enough. Cotton iodine, salve, a handful of clean rags. He poured a tin cup of water from the kettle on the stove, then dipped a rag into it. The cloth came up steaming. Carefully, he wiped the mud and blood from the foal's neck, its shoulder, its flank. The little body shivered under his touch. Beneath the grime, the hide was soft golden beneath streaks of red dirt, the color of sunlit earth after rain. "Easy now," he said quietly, his voice as steady as he could make it. "You're all right, kid. You're safe." The wound on the shoulder was bad, long, ragged, burned at the edges. He cleaned it inch by inch, jaw tight. When the foal twitched, he froze, whispering again, until the trembling eased. He tore a strip of cloth from his undershirt, wrapped it firm around the swollen leg, and tied it off with the same knot he'd once used to splint a soldier's arm in the field. "You've got fight in you," he murmured. "Don't you quit on me now." He pressed his palm to the foal's chest, felt for a heartbeat. There it was, faint, fluttering, but there. He closed his eyes, breathing with it, the rhythm sinking to his own, until man and animal shared the same fragile tempo. Outside, the rain hit the tin roof like drums, wild and relentless. Inside, it was just the sound of that tiny heart refusing to stop. Hours passed. Ethan fed the fire, added another log, then another. The flames grew strong, throwing golden light across the rough boards. He stripped off his soaked coat and hung it on a hook. Steam rose from it, twisting toward the ceiling like ghosts. Then he sat back down beside the foal, wrapping it tighter in the blanket. The firelight danced across his face, deepening the lines carved by years and silence. The barn around him creaked softly, wind, whispering through the smallest gaps in the wood. It sounded almost like voices, low, haunting, the kind that come to lonely men when storms pass too close. Ethan leaned closer to the foal, placing a hand near its muzzle. The breath that touched his skin was warm, shallow, but steady enough to keep him there. Each rise of its chest was a small miracle. He stared into the fire, lost in its flicker. Somewhere in that light, the past came crawling back. Another storm, another night filled with lightning and screaming horses. And her? A voice calling his name, cut off by the crack of thunder. He'd lost her to a flash flood years ago, just after they'd finished building the corral together. Same smell in the air that night, rain ozone, burning cedar. Same helplessness twisting inside him. Not this time. He clenched his jaw, eyes burning, and whispered to the foal, "You fight, kid. Don't give up on me now." The foal stirred faintly, a muscle twitch under his hand. It was enough. He stayed awake through the night. Each time the fire burned low, he fed it. Each time the foal's breathing stuttered, he pressed his hand to its chest and waited until it found the rhythm again. Outside, the storm slowly lost its voice thunder, fading to murmurs rain, softening to a steady drip. By the time the world went quiet, the barn felt like the only place left alive on Red Mesa. The wind had died. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. Ethan's eyes were heavy, but he refused to close them. He'd made a promise, unspoken, but true, that this one would live. And somewhere between the beats of their hearts, that promise held. The first sign of dawn came as a pale ribbon of light creeping through the cracks in the barn wall. Ethan sat slumped against a post, head-bowed eyes half shut from exhaustion. Outside, the rain had dwindled to a whisper. Inside, the air was warm enough to make the chill of the night feel like a dream. Besides, then something moved. He blinked and looked over. The blanket stirred. A faint sound, a breath, catching a sigh. He leaned forward quickly, heart pounding. The foal's ears twitched. Its front legs stretched out, brushing the straw. And then, slow but certain, its chest lifted with a stronger breath. "Well, I'll be damned." Ethan whispered, a shaky grin tugging at his mouth. "You made it through the night." He laid a hand on its neck, feeling real heat there now, the warmth of life returning. The foal exhaled a long, soft sound that could have been relief. It turned its head toward the fire, eyes still cloudy but aware. Ethan laughed once softly. It wasn't joy so much as release, the kind that makes your lungs remember what air feels like. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for storms. He felt like a man who'd finally outlived one. The days after the storm blurred together, long, quiet, and strangely gentle. Ethan spent them the only way he knew how, by doing the work that might keep something alive. The foal, Dusty, still couldn't stand for long. Most of the time, he lay curled on the blanket near the stove, breathing slow each rise of his chest, a small victory. When the wind howled through the barn slats, he flinched and trembled, eyes wide, with a fear too deep for sound. Ethan stayed close. He mixed formula in an old tin cup, held the warm bottle steady in his rough, rope-bitten hands, and tilted it carefully between Dusty's lips. At first, the foal didn't understand. Milk dribbled out and soaked Ethan's sleeves. But little by little, it began to swallow. Every sip pulled it a little further back from the edge. "That's it, kid. Easy now," Ethan murmured, voice low and steady. His tone was rough, but his touch was impossibly gentle, the kind of gentleness that only comes to men who have lost more than they could ever say. He lined the stall with fresh straw, kept the lantern burning low through the nights, and sat beside the foal with an old journal in his hands. Sometimes he read aloud, not because he needed to remember what was written, but because hearing a human voice made the barn feel less hollow. By the third night, something inside him began to soften. It had been years since peace had come to him during a storm. Now it sat quietly beside him in the shape of a golden foal, learning how to breathe again. By the third day, Dusty began to move. He lifted his head unsteady the way newborns do when they're still deciding whether life is worth trying again. His legs kicked once, twice, then folded back beneath him. Ethan smiled, setting the journal aside. "Come on, tough little fella. Let's see what you've got." He slipped his arms around the foal's shoulders, guiding gently, feeling the fragile tremor of bone and muscle fighting gravity. Dusty's hooves scrabbled in the straw, clumsy and unsure. He made it halfway up, then toppled sideways into Ethan's lap. Ethan laughed, the sound echoing softly off the wooden beams. "Close enough," he said. "You're getting there." By afternoon, the foal managed to stand for nearly half a minute. It wasn't pretty legs splayed head wobbling, but it was enough to make Ethan's chest ache with pride. Every day after that, he opened the barn door at dusk and let Dusty walk a few steps into the yard. The wind out there was cold sharp with the scent of sage and rain, but it carried the sound of the world's cicadas, distant thunder, the rustle of life returning. Ethan would whistle once short and low to signal stop. A longer note meant come back. Dusty didn't get it at first. He'd stare blankly or wander off toward a patch of sunlight. But by the 5th day, he began to understand. Now, whenever Ethan whistled long, the foal's head would lift. He'd turn ears twitching and trot clumsily backtail, flicking proud of himself for reasons only he knew. "Smart boy," Ethan said one evening as Dusty trotted up and bumped his knee with his nose. Whisper, watching from his stall, gave a soft, approving snort, the old horse's way of saying the world might still have room for miracles. Every night, Ethan lit a small fire in the barn. Not for light, though, it gave plenty, but for warmth and company. He'd sit cross-legged beside Dusty, back against a post hat tilted low, listening to the wind hum through the cracks. The flames flickered orange against the wooden walls, and the shadows of man and foal stretched long across the straw. Sometimes Dusty dreamed legs, twitching muzzle, flicking a tiny whimper rising from his throat. Ethan would reach over and rest a hand against his neck until the trembling stopped. When the silence grew too thick, he spoke not because Dusty could understand, but because words needed somewhere to go. I once had someone, he said one night, staring into the fire. Got caught in a storm, too. Didn't make it out. He poked at the embers with a stick. After that, I swore I'd never try to save another soul again, human or beast. Guess that didn't stick. His voice broke just a little on the last word. Dusty stirred half asleep and nudged his boot with his nose, a small wordless comfort. Ethan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Guess you don't care much about promises, huh?" The fire popped scattering sparks like golden snow. He watched them rise and vanish into the dark rafters. For the first time in a decade, his loneliness didn't echo. It breathed. The 6th night brought another storm. The wind returned with a vengeance, howling down from the west, rattling the barn door on its hinges. Lightning flared white through the cracks, thunder rolling deep enough to shake the beams overhead. Dusty jolted awake, trembling. He scrambled toward Ethan, pressing his head against the man's chest, heart racing under his soft hide. Ethan threw the blanket around him, rubbing his back until the shaking slowed. "You're fine, Dusty," he said quietly, his voice a calm counterpoint to the fury outside. "Storm's just talking, not fighting." A flash of light split the dark, and for a heartbeat their shadows leapt tall across the wall man and Foal side by side, immortalized in lightning. Ethan stared at it, a strange calm filling him. Once the sound of thunder had meant death loss, helplessness. Now it just meant the sky was remembering him. When the storm softened to rain, he pushed the door open and stepped out. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the scent of wet dust and ozone. Far off through the silver curtain of drizzle, something moved. On the ridge beyond the ranch, a silhouette stood massive still, the shape of a horse, too large to be real. Ethan froze. His heart kicked hard once then again. He squinted, but the rain blurred the distance. The figure didn't move, it just watched. And then, as lightning flashed again, it was gone. He stood there a long moment and rain running down his face. Maybe it was nothing, a trick of light, a tired mind seeing stories in the storm. But the smell that lingered in the air, the strange blend of ozone, rain, and something older, felt too alive to be imagination. he whispered into the wind. "You out there." No answer came, but the next gust carried a faint echo of hoofbeats across the plains. Morning came bright and clear. The world outside glittered with the sheen of new rain, every blade of grass crowned in gold. Steam rose from the soaked earth, curling around the fences in thin ribbons. Ethan opened the barn door. "Go on, Dusty. Let's see what you got today." The foal stepped out cautiously, at first sniffing the air. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he trotted into the sunlight, his coat shining like polished bronze. He kicked once at nothing, tossed his head, and let out a high, soft whinny that carried over the wet fields. Ethan leaned against the post arms, folded, smiling to himself. "You're something else, kid," he said. "Ain't no storm gonna scare you now." He fetched a small wooden plank from the shed and carved the words with his pocket knife, "Dusty's Corner." He nailed it above the stall door, then stepped back to look at it. It wasn't much, but it made the barn feel different, alive again. Between the smell of hay, the flicker of fire each night, and the soft sound of hooves shifting in straw, the place had a heartbeat now. That evening, as the sun sank over Red Mesa, Ethan took his old wooden flute from a shelf. It had been years since he'd played, not since the woman he'd loved had listened to it by firelight one final time. He hesitated, then lifted it to his lips and began to play. The notes drifted through the twilight, soft and full of ache, floating out across the wet fields. Dusty raised his head, ears-pricked eyes gleaming with the reflection of the dying sun. Whisper snorted gently from his stall, as if recognizing the tune. The melody carried into the open sky not a song of sorrow, but of something gentler reborn. By the 10th morning, Dusty stood strong and steady. And the man who once swore never to care again had found something worth staying alive for. The morning after the 10th night broke like a promise. Red Mesa shimmered beneath a sky so clear it seemed newly made. Dew clung to every blade of grass, turning the plains into a sea of scattered diamonds. The scent of wet earth rose with the warmth of the first light. Ethan opened the barn doors and squinted into the sun. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. Even the fences seemed to stand taller, their weathered boards glinting with beads of water. Dusty burst from the stall the moment the latch lifted. He galloped across the yard hooves, kicking up droplets that caught the sunlight like sparks. His mane, gold and pale as dry wheat, fluttered behind him. Every movement radiated life. Ethan watched arms, folded, a smile tugging faintly at his mouth. But behind that smile was a quiet heaviness. He had known this moment was coming. All night he hadn't slept. He'd sat by the dimming fire, listening to the rain fade and watching the little horse breathe, knowing Dawn would ask something of him he didn't want to give. Now, as sunlight poured across the mesa, he turned toward the open gate at the far end of the property. The wind had died. The land was still too still, as if the world itself waited for him to say goodbye. He reached for the rope at Dusty's neck and began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the one before. The sound of small hooves followed him, soft and steady, tapping out a rhythm like a countdown. At the gate he stopped. His throat ached with words he didn't know how to say. The wooden gate marked the border between the world of men and the untamed beyond. Ethan stood there a long time, one hand resting on the latch and the other absently stroking Dusty's mane. He crouched and untied the leather cord that had hung loosely around the young horse's neck, not a leash, not really, just a reminder of belonging. It fell to the dirt with a soft sound, leaving behind a faint mark on the golden fur. "Go on, kid," he said, his voice low and rough. "The wild's yours now." Dusty lifted his head. His ears twitched. His eyes, deep unclouded, now met Ethan's, and in them was something that shouldn't have been possible understanding. The air held its breath. No wind, no sound but the whisper of grass. Even the skies seemed to pause, waiting for the moment to pass. Dusty stepped back once, uncertain, then forward again. He snorted softly, pawed the earth, and looked to the horizon. The light of the late afternoon wrapped him in gold. His coat shimmered, not like flesh, but like metal melting under the sun. Ethan swallowed hard. Each step the foal took away from him felt like losing a heartbeat. When Dusty had reached the edge of the pasture, Ethan released the gate. The hinges creaked open. He didn't call out. He didn't whistle the tune the horse had learned. He only smiled, a tired, tender smile, the kind of smile a man wears when he's learned that love isn't about holding on, but knowing when to let go. A warm gust passed between them, carrying the smell of grass, rain, and something else, freedom. Then the world changed. The light dimmed without warning. The warm gold bled from the mesa, replaced by a strange, heavy gray. Ethan frowned and turned toward the west. The sky had begun to boil, clouds folding over one another like waves, black and silver alive, with silent flashes. The air thickened the stillness, turning unnatural. Whisper whinnied sharply from the barn, stomping in his stall. A flock of sparrows burst from the cottonwoods, wheeling wildly before vanishing into the storm front. Ethan felt it before he heard it, a deep rhythmic tremor that rose through the soles of his boots. The ground was shaking. Not much, just enough to make the fence rattle. He laid a hand on the wooden gatepost and felt the faint, steady pulse of something moving beneath the earth. He turned back toward the open plain. Dusty had stopped halfway across the field. The foal stood perfectly still, ears pricked and nostrils flaring. He was looking west toward the gathering dark. "Easy boy," Ethan called, though his voice felt small in that vast silence. The horizon flickered white. Then came the thunder, long, low, like a drumbeat rolling through the bones of the land. Dusty answered with a single, soft whinny. And then through the curtain of rain that had begun to fall again, something moved. A shape, large, silent, and impossibly real. It stepped out from the storm as if the clouds themselves had given it form. A horse, but no horse Ethan had ever seen. It was massive, towering, nearly twice the height of an ordinary stallion. Its coat shimmered silver gray, catching every bolt of lightning as if woven from stormlight. Its mane streamed in the wind like smoke, and from its eyes glowed a faint electric blue, the color of a summer sky seen through rain. Thunderheart. The name came to Ethan's mind, unbidden, whispered by something older than thought. The creature moved with the weight of mountains and the grace of wind. Each step cracked the earth and stirred spirals of dust that danced in its wake. Ethan stood frozen, his breath caught. For an instant, he wasn't a man anymore, just part of the land, small beneath the endless sky. Thunderheart came to a stop a few yards from Dusty. The smaller horse trembled but didn't flee. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, eyes wide but calm, as if drawn by recognition deeper than instinct. The great stallion lowered his own head in return. Their muzzles touched a brief, gentle contact that sent a ripple through the air like heat off stone. Ethan's throat closed. "You must be his kin," he whispered, barely audible above the wind. "Ain't you?" Thunderheart stood still, then lifted his gaze and looked directly at Ethan. Those blue eyes weren't wild. They were deep, ancient, patient, knowing. Lightning flashed behind him, turning the world white. And in that instant, Ethan saw something that made his heart stutter sorrow. The storm broke, then rain pouring in thick sheets. Thunderheart stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until the ground between them steamed with heat from the rain striking his coat. Ethan didn't move. When the stallion lowered his massive head, Ethan found himself reaching out without thinking. The beast's forehead pressed lightly against his shoulder. A hum low electric passed through him. It wasn't pain, but warmth, alive and ancient, threading into his bones. For one breathless heartbeat, he felt everything: the pulse of the desert, the weight of storms, the eternal rhythm of life that had been here long before men ever rode across it. It was power, yes, but more than that, it was acceptance. Thunderheart was not there to threaten. He was there to claim not the land, but the bond that had been born in Ethan's barn, between Dusty and the man who had saved him. When the stallion finally stepped back, Ethan's hands were trembling. The rain fell harder now. Thunderheart turned toward the plains, gave a single deep whinny, a sound so vast it rolled like thunder across the valley. Dusty lifted his head and answered bright and pure, the call of a child to a parent. And then he ran. Ethan could only watch as the two shapes, one silver, one gold, broke into a gallop. They moved together like twin bolts of light, vanishing into the veil of rain. For a long time, he didn't move. Water streamed down his face, cold and clean, mixing with tears he didn't remember shedding. When the clouds finally began to thin, the world was silent again. Only hoofprints remained deep and perfect, pressed into the wet earth like signatures of a dream. The air smelled of ozone and sage and something sacred. Ethan let out a shaky breath and whispered, "If that was real." Then I just shook hands with the wild itself. Far-off thunder rolled one last time, a single distant boom like an answer. Ethan turned back toward the ranch boots, squelching in the mud. The light was fading, the land glowing faintly under the dying storm. Behind him, Red Mesa lay still, washed clean by rain and legend. And though he walked alone, he carried with him the quiet certainty that he had witnessed something few ever would have farewell, not just between man and horse, but between the mortal and the eternal. The rain stopped near midnight. Red Mesa lay wrapped in a deep, breathless silence, the kind that feels like the land itself has paused to listen. A faint moon pushed through drifting clouds, spilling a thin silver light across the soaked plains. The grass still shimmered with rain, each droplet trembling in the faint wind. Ethan sat by the small window of his cabin, the lantern unlit. He didn't need light to see the afterimage of what he'd witnessed burned bright enough inside him. Beyond the window, the dark stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The barn was a black silhouette, and the fields beyond were an ocean of shadows. He could still feel it, the weight of Thunderheart's forehead against his shoulder. The warmth that wasn't fire, wasn't lightning, something older, purer. Even now, when he closed his eyes, he saw those blue eyes staring through the rain. Whispers shifted restlessly in the barn, hooves scraping softly against the wood. The old horse gave a low, uneasy whinny, as if remembering the same vision. Ethan pulled his coat over his shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air met him like a familiar hand, damp, honest, and filled with the scent of earth and storm. He stood there for a long while, eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind whispered through the wet grass. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to move, no fear of the dark. He could hear the slow, steady beat of his heart, proof that he was still here, still breathing, still part of whatever had passed through this place. A faint flicker of lightning split the sky sometime after midnight. It was brief, but bright enough to turn night into glass. For an instant, Ethan saw them. Two shapes out on the open field, motionless, silent, bathed in the pale glow of the storm. One tall and broad, the other smaller but strong, standing side by side, both facing the ranch. He blinked, thinking it must be his imagination. But another flash came, and there they were again, clear, undeniable. The great stallion mane silver and wild, and beside him, the golden foal whose heart he had once kept alive through a night of fire and rain. Thunderheart and Dusty. Ethan's chest tightened. He stepped off the porch boots, sinking into the wet ground. The night air was sharp, full of the metallic scent of rain and ozone. The storm growled far to the west, a low rolling sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones. But neither horse moved. They simply stood watchful and still as though guarding the ranch. He took another step forward toward the fence line. His coat clung to him, soaked through, but he didn't feel the cold. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of horses, warm hide, wet mane, and a trace of wild grass. When he reached the fence, lightning flashed again, and they were gone. Just darkness, just rain. Only the echo of thunder fading into the distance. Ethan lowered his head and whispered into the wind, "Thank you. Both of you." The rain answered with a single drop landing on his cheek, cool as a tear. By morning, the storm had vanished. Red Mesa shone under a sky of impossible blue, clean and white as forever. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of wet sage and dust drying under sunlight. Ethan walked the fence line slowly, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Every step brought a new glimmer where the light hit puddles of rain. Then he stopped. Just ahead in the mud near the north fence were hoof prints, deep, clear, impossible. Some small, round-edged and familiar. Others, massive. Twice the size of any horse he'd ever seen. He knelt, tracing one with his hand. The edges were sharp, unblurred by rain, as if pressed there only hours ago. Beside them, smaller prints overlapped Dusty's, no doubt. The two sets circled the ranch, looping close to the barn, then veering toward the western gate. It was a patrol, a guardian's path. Near the gate, something else caught his eye, a small pile of gray ash, still faintly warm to the touch. The remains of a fire. Ethan crouched beside it, fingertips brushing through the embers. Not a single human footprint around it. Just the hoof prints, large and small, crossing near and moving on. He looked up at the sky, at the soft white clouds drifting over Red Mesa, at the way the light shimmered off the hills. It didn't feel empty. It felt watched over. Maybe it wasn't superstition. Maybe it was gratitude, the land's way of saying thank you. He broke a dry branch of yucca from the fence post, stuck it upright in the ashes, and let the wind have its way with it. The gray dust lifted and blew west, the same direction Thunderheart had gone. Ethan whispered, "If you're still out there, I'll keep the fire for you too." That night, the sky was clear, and the stars burned like cold embers above the desert. Ethan sat on the porch with his old wooden flute across his knees. He hadn't meant to play. Not tonight. But his hands found the shape of the notes anyway. The melody rose softly into the stillness, the same tune he'd played for Dusty before every storm. Halfway through, he stopped. Something inside him said to listen instead. He pursed his lips and let out a long, low whistle, the one Dusty had learned as a call. The sound stretched into the night, carried far by the dry wind. At first, nothing. Then faintly from somewhere beyond the mesas came an answer. A single drawn-out whinny, deep and full of thunder, rolling through the distance like a memory. Whisper lifted his head in the barn, ears sharp, eyes shining. Ethan smiled, though his eyes stung. "Easy, boys," he murmured to the darkness. "I know you're there." He sat until the night grew colder, whistling every so often, and each time something answered. Sometimes the echo of hooves, sometimes just the wind, carrying that strange hollow sound that might have been a neigh or might have been the earth breathing. From that night on, it became a ritual. Every evening he'd whistle once before bed, and somewhere in the dark, the wild would answer. Some nights, it was faint and far away. Some nights, it was close enough to feel. And when the wind shifted just right, he could swear he smelled them, the musk of rain-soaked hide, the faint scent of sage and lightning. He no longer feared the solitude. The ranch no longer felt empty. It pulsed quietly with presence, the kind that doesn't fade when the body's gone. Autumn came to Red Mesa like a fire made of gold. The grass turned to copper, and the air carried the first bite of cold. Ethan's days settled into rhythm work, quiet, and the simple peace of being watched over. Every evening he'd sit on the porch pipe or flute in hand watching the sun sink behind the mesas. Just before the last light vanished, he'd give his whistle, and without fail from somewhere beyond the horizon, an answering cry would rise long, strong, and alive. A call of thunder in twilight. The townsfolk didn't believe his stories. They laughed when he told them about the giant horse and the night of lightning. But Ethan didn't argue. He didn't need to. He knew the truth wasn't for proving. It was for keeping quiet and sacred, like a prayer whispered into the wind. He wrote the final words of that truth in his old leather journal, the same one he'd once used for weather notes and horse feed counts. Some bonds don't end in life or death. They ride on the wind, and they come back with the rain. He closed the book, set it on the windowsill, and listened to the evening settle. Out in the distance, a low familiar whinny echoed once through the fading light. Ethan smiled, leaned back in his chair, and tipped his hat to the sound. Red Mesa was never silent again. 2 years slipped by like dust on the wind. Red Mesa changed with them. The amber seas of grass browned to brittle straw, the creek in Broken Arrow Canyon dwindled to a throat-clearing trickle, and a powder of red grit seemed to hang permanently in the air. You could taste it when you spoke. You could hear it when you breathed. Ethan stayed. He was older at the edges, silver at the temple's new lines cut around his eyes, but his gaze had sharpened into the kind of quiet that comes after a man has made peace with what he can't keep. Each evening, he still sat on the porch and whistled into the failing light. Some nights, faint as a dream, a deep, answering whinny rolled back across the flats. Some nights, there was only wind. Either way, he smiled. The drought of that second summer was a hard one, mean as rust. Cracks veined the clay like a map of old wounds. Dust devils prowled the distance, swirling columns the color of dried blood. Lightning laced the sky week after week, without a drop of rain, the kind they call dry strikes, worse than any storm, because they promise water and deliver fire. In his journal, Ethan wrote, "The air smells like fire, waiting to be born." The town emptied to a murmur. Families pulled up stakes. A few ranches clung on, grudging his mesquite roots. Then came that July night. A west wind rose sudden, snapping the yucca stalks. Black clouds stacked like anvils along the far mesas, and they carried no rain, only charge. Something in the pressure made the land hold its breath. Ethan felt it in his bones as surely as he felt his own heartbeat. He set his cup down and whispered to the empty yard, "All right then." The first thunderclap cracked open the sky like a split log. Lightning speared a stand of dead juniper on the south ridge above Broken Arrow. For one white instant, the world was etched in stark detail, the fence line drawn thin across the dark and the barn's pitched roof. Ethan's face turned upward. Then night slammed back and the hills bloomed orange. Flame rose in a wall that strode with the wind. Dust joined it, a red veil, and the smoke turned the stars to smudges. Ethan ran for the barn. The horses were already screaming. He flung the doors wide, slapped halters on frantic heads, and drove the herd into the yard with raw-voiced commands. "Move, come on, whisper. This way." The old gray gelding danced, but obeyed, herding the younger ones with nips and bluff charges. Ethan pushed them toward the dry creek that might at least be a break in the fuel, but the wind spun on its heel without warning. A fire whirl lifted from the burning ridge and skipped across the flats like a match flicked between fingers. Cinders rained. The far fence went up with a whoomph. The near fence caught an instant later. Heat marched in waves. Smoke dropped like a curtain and hid the world. Ethan's lungs clawed at nothing. He staggered to the side gate to throw it open and found himself beneath a falling beam charred wood that came down with the weight of a sentence. It pinned his lower leg to the packed earth with a jolt that turned his breath to knives. He grabbed for the timber, pulled until his forearms shook and gained nothing but splinters and a hoarse cry. The fire gathered at the margins, nipping forward, then rushing in. Sound narrowed to the roar of oxygen feeding flame. Color narrowed to red, black, and gold. Smoke made a world of its own, and he floated inside it, lightheaded, trying to count the horses by their shadows, and losing track after 3. He thought without surprise, "So this is how I go, same as she did. Same weather, same sky." The heat ate the air and scalded what air remained. Sparks stitched through smoke. His shirt began to smolder at the shoulder. Ethan lowered his face to the dirt and coughed until darkness flickered at the edges. Then another sound entered the fire's voice, at first just a suggestion in the roar, then a rhythm. Hooves. Heavy ones. Not the panic drumming of frightened stock, but a measured thunder like a drum line, riding up from the earth itself. It rolled and gathered, came nearer, until it pressed in his chest like an oncoming storm. He raised his head through a slit of scorched air and saw a thing that could not be real. The fire splitting around a moving shape, 2 tongues of flame, shying aside as though some invisible prow cut them. A silver mass surged through smoke mane, streaming in sparks, the giant horse of the storms made of rainless lightning and old rumors. Thunderheart. Beside him ran a gold body with the span and muscle of a prime stallion, a black-tipped mane tossed like a banner in the wind. Dusty, grown burnished by sun, broader through the chest. Time had made him beautiful and fierce. Dusty. You remember Ethan choked the words, breaking in a cough and a laugh at once. Thunderheart screamed a challenge that shook the heat. He plunged between Ethan and the advancing flame's body, angled to shield hooves, striking hard. Steam roared from his coat where heat and sweat met. The smoke's edge wavered like a living thing denied its meal. Dusty lowered his head and seized the charred crossbeam in his teeth. He heaved. The timber creaked and held. He heaved again, and it splintered down its length. Ethan scrabbled at the gap, felt space open beneath his shin. "Come on, boy," pulled. Dusty gathered and tore back a 3rd time. The beam went with a crack, leaping from Ethan's leg and careening into the mud. Pain burst like light, then receded to a pounding ache. Ethan rolled, dragged himself clear on his elbows, and tried to stand. His leg buckled. Dusty shouldered in under him like a practice partner, the warm solid of a living wall. Ethan grabbed the coarse mane, found purchase. Thunderheart struck the ground with both forehooves, and sparks flew like red stars. Something about that blow, about all of them, seemed to push the fire's tongue back a step. Above them, the sky split again, and for once the lightning was not alone. Big drops hit the dust and shattered it into scent and mud. Rain? Late, but in time. "Let's move," Ethan rasped. The words were for himself as much as them. Dusty took his weight delicately. Thunderheart pivoted with that impossible balance of power, his shoulder brushing Ethan's as if to say, "Follow." They moved as three staggering surging, shoved by wind and pulled by instinct. The air filled with a river of ash and water. Dead grass turned to black lace underfoot. A fence post blew apart beside them with a gunshot crack. Dusty flinched and recovered, bearing Ethan around the wreck. Thunderheart ranged out toward the glow and came back again, a shepherd made of thunder and muscle, keeping the flames' attention where his great body could keep them off. At the break in the fence, the ground pitched down toward the creek bed. Another strike landed in the far field, close enough to make their teeth ring. Thunderheart stopped and looked back. Those eyes, blue as a summer bolt, met Ethan's through the falling rain. The same look as that first night, ancient, steady, and impossibly kind. "Go," Ethan said to both of them, not knowing whether he meant go on or go with me. Dusty shifted, took a step, then another, sliding and catching, until they reached the creek's shallow run of black water and slick stone. He sank to one knee so Ethan could half fall, half slide into the puddled sand. Thunderheart's great head swung once toward Dusty, and he touched his muzzle to the younger horse's neck, brief, definite, like a seal pressed on cooling wax. Ethan tried to push himself up again. The world tipped. He saw two horses framed against rain and flame bodies luminous with wet, and thought he said their names, Dusty, Thunderheart. But it might have been only breath. They stepped away together upstream into the veil of weather until the gray took them. The fire hissed at their departure and sank under the weight of the storm it had called down. Ethan lay where the water could find him and let the rain do its slow work. The night hammered the canyon. Hours of rain, hours of thunder beating itself thin. Toward dawn, a white gauze of steam rose from the charred ground. The fire was a memory of heat, the grass a stubble of black. When light crept into the world again, the creek bank held one sleeping figure close, scorched along one side, hair plastered to his forehead, a smile ghosting his mouth as if the last dream had been kind. Around him, the ash of Red Mesa shone like spilled stars. Farther off in the wet cinder, two trails ran side by side, one as deep as a man's forearm and the other smaller but clean and true. They led toward the north, toward whatever waited where the mesas joined, and the storms liked to wander. The air still held that scent, ozone and smoke, and beneath it a greener breath, the smell of something starting over. Sun woke him. It speared his eyelids and drew him back up through mud and sleep. Ethan squinted against the glare and found the sky an impossible blue, glazed high with thin cloud. His palms pressed into cool silt. Water whispered past his fingers. He pushed himself up and sat there with the creek shouldering his hip and the wind combing his hair. Everything beyond him had been blackened, the valley a painting brushed with coal. Here and there the ash had been kicked back to reveal wet earth. Hoof prints, new ones, marched north. Each print was a basin filled with reflected sky. The larger ones looked carved too neat to have been made by anything earthly. The smaller set left a rhythm he knew as well as his own breathing. He lifted a hand to his shoulder and felt a tack of something rough against the seam of his shirt. A hair-pale gold, long as his palm, kinked where it had dried. It smelled of rain and smoke and sun. He laughed, and then he cried, and then he did both at once. Guessed the wild don't forget kindness, after all he said to the creek, to the wind, to whoever might have been listening from the rim. The light changed, the kind of change you feel more than see, like a room where someone has stepped into the doorway. Ethan shaded his eyes and looked up toward Red Mesa. Mist lingered in sheets along the slopes, steaming out of the black ground. as the sun warmed it. On the highest spine of rock, two shapes stood where the sky started, one vast and silver one, lit with a gold that matched the hair twined in his fingers. They faced the valley with a stillness that belonged to stone. When the sun's first strong bar rose and struck their backs, both coats answered one in a flash, like sheet lightning one in a low copper glow. Thunderheart raised his head. Dusty stood close-tail, moving lazily in the morning wind. The air brought their voices down to him, one deep a sound, born somewhere below language, one bright and thin like a trumpet call a mile off. Ethan did what felt right. He put two fingers to his tongue and whistled the long note he had taught a little foal in a burning summer. The sound streamed away and seemed to hang there. The two horses turned their faces toward him. That was all. They did not approach. They did not flee. A moment later, the mist climbed and took them lifting across the ridge, leaving behind nothing but a sheen of damp on the rock and the uncanny certainty that they had been there. Ethan stood a long time with his hands hooked on his belt and the creek speaking at his feet. He felt gratitude settle, not the loud kind that shouts, but the kind that roots itself somewhere deep and starts quietly breaking tough soil with new life. He healed in weeks, not months. The body finds its work and does it. The leg complained, but held. He mended fence, planed new rails from cedar scars left by the fire, and raised stalls where the old ones had fallen. The smell of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil filled the mornings. In the afternoons, he scattered seed from a bag he'd been saving for rain that never came. Now the timing was right. A green fuzz took hold across the black the fire had laid down. The first shoots made a color you don't forget, the shade of hope when it's still small enough to count in blades. On the old gateboard, he carved a line with his knife, and then another, careful, slow, the way a man writes a prayer he intends to keep. When he finished, he ran his thumb across the letters. Here began the circle. He hung the plank where the afternoon sun would find it, and let the words silver with weather. The creek returned to its voice, a little stronger each morning, a little cleaner. The sky over Red Mesa shook off its pall and turned the exact blue you think of when you picture freedom. On still days when the heat lay flat on the land and the air held the smell of mending things, Ethan would walk the ash flats and sometimes catch the drummed echo of hooves too regular to be wind, too full of intent to be mistake. Sometimes a whiff drifted by horsehair and rain on rock, and he'd touch the brim of his hat and say, "You boys did your part. Now it's my turn." When the ranch sat upright again, fences straight, barn roof tight, the field skinned with new grass, Ethan lit a small fire in the cabin stove and opened his old journal. The book was scorched along one edge from that night, the leather puckered, the pages wrinkled from rain. He turned to a clean sheet and wrote slow enough to feel each word settle. 2 horses came through the fire last night. One was the wild itself. The other remembered my heart. He closed the book and laid it on the table. Outside, the night had gathered without him noticing. A north wind sang high in the yucca. Stars hung low as if the world had risen to meet them. He stepped onto the porch and slid his hands into his pockets. The boards felt cool under his bare feet. He whistled long and clear a note with the shape of a road in it. The sound went out, and the silence drank it. He waited not with hope exactly, but with the simple patience of a man who has accepted that some answers come when they want to, not when they're called. From far off, soft as the scuff of a coat across a chair, came a reply. Not loud, not close, but there so distinct it rearranged the hairs on his arms. He let out his breath and smiled in the dark. "Good night," he said to whoever might have been moving out there where the mesa meets the sky. Before sleep took him, he sat on the edge of his bed and spoke to a photograph he kept tucked in the mirror frame. The woman in it smiled too widely for the old camera to catch clean eyes blown by sunlight. "Maybe the storm brought him for me," he said, "so I could keep my promise right this time." He turned the lamp low, and the room settled into a quiet that held. The last morning of this part of his life rose red, one of those dawns that set the whole plain on fire without burning a thing. Ethan stood at the fence and watched the light run its hands along the grass. Somewhere off to the west, a coyote sang a single note, then thought better of it. He looked to the notch where two mesas met a wide V that framed the far distance. Mist pooled there the way water does, and in it, two figures came on at an easy lope. They were not close enough to see clearly, but the way they took the ground told the story the big one's stride, covering miles like yardage, the smaller matched to it perfectly step for step. They passed along the horizon like a line drawn by a steady hand, and climbed toward the notch, their bodies catching the sun until they were only light with shapes inside it. The sound reached him a few breaths later, hoofbeats rolling like a hymn, the rhythm of land that has found its legs again. It carried a message that didn't need words. The earth wrote it in the soles of his boots. At the last rise before the notch, they turned their heads toward him in the same instant. He did not wave. He didn't need to. He laid his palm on the top rail and felt through the wood the small tremor of their passing. When they disappeared beyond the western shoulder, the sun stood up fully. Its light poured down on a set of prints by the north gate, old now, but not gone in the big size and the smaller. The edges gleamed as if some hand had freshened them with a hot iron. Ethan's mouth made a smile that didn't rush and didn't falter. He understood something then that he might have always known, but had never put to words. The wild keeps its own ledger. The wind carries memory. A kindness walks farther than a man's feet, and what you give the world comes back wearing different skin. He said it out loud the way a man speaks a truth to make sure it stays. On this land, kindness never dies. It rides with the wind, returns with the storm, and leaves hoofprints that no rain can wash away. He stood there until the heat came on and the day began, until the coffee needed making and the fence 100 yards north begged a new brace post, until life, as it always does, asked to be lived. And as he turned toward the house, the ranch and the man at its heart felt the same, built again from fire and rain, rooted under a sky that remembers.